Good morning, everyone. My name's Jeff Schiffer, and we're here today to talk a little bit about dreams and twisted thoughts. When I think about dreams and twisted thoughts from the perspective of Aboriginal focusing-oriented therapy, I think it's great to think about how dreams connect us to across the generations, across time, to land, and really to all our relations from an Indigenous perspective. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Indigenous perspectives on dreams. We'll bring in some Western dream science, and then we're going to learn a little bit about how to sit with our dreams and receive messages from them. So dreaming is a human universal. It's something that all mammals do. If anybody in the audience owns dogs or cats, we know that we sometimes see our dog sleeping, kicking its leg. Our dog is having dreams. And it's something that humans have done for a really long time. Across the millennia, in different cultures and different times and places, there's been a really long tradition of connecting dreams to wellness. In places like ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient Greece, Rome, and Christian Europe, and of course, across the Indigenous world, people have realized that there's something happening between dreams and wellness. What Western dream scientists are starting to understand is that the dreaming brain enables the awake brain. Dreaming helps us with affect regulation. The emotions that we pick up throughout the day, that we carry vicariously through interactions in our workplace and our family and throughout our lives, we discharge those emotions while we're at sleep, while we're dreaming. And that helps us with emotional competence and basically to be able to regulate our mood. We also know that dreams are key to emotional competence, cognitive processing, and also learning and innovation. So people solve problems in their dreams, receive messages in their dreams. And from the perspective of IFOT, dreams also bring us critical messages that are sort of stepping stones into our path to healing and wellness. This includes interaction with life, land, and intergenerational knowledge. So I just wanted to share a few examples about the history of dreams and wellness. A long time ago in Africa and ancient Egypt, thousands of years ago, priests were also medical specialists. And they used dream interpretation for their diagnosis and treatment. Not much later in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, dream interpretation were also used as medical prescriptions. So, essentially, in ancient Greece, the clinicians believed that you actually had to also know the history of the dreamer to be able to connect that dream to wellness. And this changed a little bit in after the death of Christ, AD, in Europe, when Christianity began to take a different view about dreams, wondering whether dreams were visions from God or messages from the devil or demons. And we'll talk a little bit about sleep paralysis later and the long history of people thinking that sometimes when they wake up paralyzed, they're being visited by a demon or an evil. And so all of this played into less use of dreams, actually, in the prescriptions of wellness. In Asia, of course, Ayurvedic medicine also used a lot of dreaming, and so did Chinese medicine, using the interpretation of dreams to get important information about herbs and different remedies to prescribe for wellness. And then we know that across the Turtle Island, across the Americas, and elsewhere in the Indigenous world, there's been a really, really long tradition of looking at dreams for wellness and also receiving important insights through dreams about medicines and ceremony and intergenerational knowledge, which we're going to discuss a little bit further. So I wanted to spend some time on the Indigenous perspectives of dreams. And of course, we know there's many different Indigenous peoples and cultures and many different distinct perspectives. But to bring them all together and talk about some of the commonalities that we see, particularly across North America, Indigenous cultures have viewed dreams as a means of obtaining knowledge, wisdom, and guidance in life. They've looked at some dreams as visits from the ancestors, visits from the spirits of plants and animals, and really as a source of providing insight into what has happened, what is happening, and what may happen in the future. I think another important thing to note is that from an Indigenous perspective, dreams are collective. They're collective and they're holistic. And what I mean to say by holistic is that, Aboriginal folk typically think of people as having 4 different dimensions, right? We've got the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. And when we think about dreaming, we can break them down into those 4 categories and realize that there's these 4 distinct dimensions of dreaming. right? So if we think about the physical dimensions of dreaming, we know that dreaming is physiological. We know there's a physiological process happening in the brain. We know that when you fall asleep, a biological program clicks on in the brain, and about every 90 minutes, we go through this physiological sleep cycle. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We also know that dreams are mental. Right? We also know that there's a mental process going on. And what I mean by that is that dreams are bringing us knowledge. They're helping us solve problems, right? And we know that a lot of innovation has happened in dreams. We know that if you fall asleep and ask for a dream to solve a particular problem, studies out of Harvard have shown that about 50% of people that ask for a solution to a problem before going to bed are able to train themselves to get some kind of solution from their dreams. We know that dreams are also emotional. I was talking a moment ago about affect regulation, about emotional contagion. Scientists are learning about the mirror neuron system and understanding about how we're wired together, and that we pick up the emotions from our colleagues and our family, and that dreams are fundamental in discharging this emotional release as we sleep. And then we also have the spiritual dimension of dreaming, and that's particularly significant for Indigenous people who also understand that in particular instances, dreams can be visits from ancestors and messages from spirits that provide really particular and important information. Another one. So, physical aspects of dreaming, I just want to take a little bit more time to break that down. One of the best known examples is sleep paralysis. And so we do know, and we'll talk a little bit more about sleep paralysis, but we do know that our body keeps us safe so that we don't hurt ourselves in our dreams, and that when we do kick in to REM sleep, neurotransmitters are released by our brain, and that paralyzes our bodies. Our muscles are paralyzed, so that when we dream that we can open our bedroom window and fly, we don't actually jump out that window in our sleep, right? We do know that sometimes when that neurotransmitter does not stop being released in the brain, and we wake up prematurely, we feel as though we're paralyzed. And we'll talk a little bit more about sleep paralysis later. We also know that night terrors are a physical aspect of dreaming. So we know that some children often between the ages of 3 or 4 and 8 or 9 get night terrors, which is a fundamentally different process than nightmares. They'll typically be thrashing. And when it comes to night terrors, this is a physiological process of development in the brain. It's a process where certain centers of the brain are still working themselves out. And actually, it's not good to wake somebody up when they're having a night terror. One of the ways you can tell a difference between a night terror and a nightmare is that when somebody wakes up from a night terror, they don't remember a nightmare that they've just had. With a nightmare, you remember, oh my God, I was just being chased through the woods by somebody with an axe, and you're very clear about what you just dreamt about. But with a night terror, there's no recollection, because you really weren't having a nightmare. It was a physiological process in the brain that was working itself out and being displayed throughout your body, not being paralyzed in that instance, right? We also know that the physiology of dreams is connected to human development. So, for example, puberty, right? If we look at young men throughout puberty, there's often a lot of sexual dreams. There's often a lot of wet dreams, right? And this is the body practicing ejaculation, practicing becoming sexually mature. It's tied to that process of human development for men. Much like it is for men, it's connected to women, and we see a heightened amount of dreaming happening in women around menopause. And those can often be sexualized dreams, but a lot of things are going on with hormonal changes in the body. And so that's another example of the physical aspects of dreaming. I wanted to take some time to talk a little bit about the mental aspects of dreaming and just share a few stories, because throughout the course of history, a lot of important inventions and a lot of important problems have been solved by dreamers in their sleep. So some of you may know the story of Elias Howe. Elias Howe is the inventor of the modern sewing machine. Around 1845, he invented the sewing machine, and the way that he tells the story is that he had a dream. He was having real trouble figuring out where to put the thread in the sewing machine. He couldn't get it to work. And he went to bed and he had a dream one night, actually, that he was being chased throughout a jungle by cannibals. He was being chased in this dark jungle, was running through the woods, and eventually these cannibals surrounded him, and they all had spears, and they came closer, and they started spearing him, and they speared him to death. But right before they killed him in his dream and he woke up, he realized that the points on all of the spears had a little hole right in the tip, and that's where he needed to put the hole in the sewing machine. And he actually attributes that dream to solving the problem of the sewing machine. Along a similar light, there was a woman named Madam C.J. Walker. She was an African-American woman living in the United States in the 1890s. And she had a bit of an issue with her hair. All of her hair was falling out. This was a big problem for her. And she ended up going to bed one night and having a dream. This man, this maybe an ancestor or a big man, visited her in her dream, and he said, he said to her, if you want to fix your hair, you got to get all of these certain plants and you got to mix them together and you got to put them on your hair. And as the story goes, she needed to send back to Africa for some of these plants. Some of the plants were locally available. She put all these botanicals together, and she did indeed put it on her scalp, and her hair grew back. And she didn't actually stop there. She founded a line of hair products, and Madam C.J. Walker actually became the first female self-made millionaire in the United States, all through this dream, these hair products that she ended up inventing through this information that she had received in dreams. And we also know this to be the case with Indigenous medicines, right? Throughout history, when we look at Western medicine, it's quite a short history. Western doctors are able to do phenomenal things. But it's only in recent history that we've had surgery and various other medicines that Western medicine brings. The Indigenous world is very old, and Indigenous people have been having to solve medical problems for millennia. Some people call the Amazon the pharmacy of the earth, right? A lot of the medicines that we use today come from the Amazon. When pharmacologists and anthropologists and other folks have gone down to the Amazon to talk to the Indigenous people there and say, hey, how did you figure out the 14 steps that were necessary to turn this, poisonous jungle vine into a medicine? The Indigenous folk down there attribute it all to dreams. They say the spirits of the plants came and visited us in our dreams and told us how to do this, right? And so there's many different ways in which dreams bring us solutions to the problems that we're facing in our life. And I talked a little bit earlier about some of the studies that have come out of Harvard. And what they show us is that about 50% of people can will themselves to dream about something in particular, and approximately half of those people are able to get a gratifying answer to the problem that they've seek to address. Mm-hmm. Now, when we move on to the emotional aspect of dreaming, this is really important for IFOT work. This is really important for working with complex trauma, is the understanding of how dreams support affect regulation and emotional competence. And also the understanding that while that happens a lot at night, IFOT dream work allows us also to do that throughout the day. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how dreaming provides a safe space for us to practice scenarios and discharge emotion in ways that are really fundamental to our emotional experience and our holistic health. So as one example, when my first son was cutting his teeth, he was teething really, really hard. He would get up and he would be crying at night, red cheeks and drooling, and it was incredibly painful for him. And a couple weeks into that process, I started having this reoccurring dream where at night my adult teeth would be falling out. I'd have a dream. My adult teeth would just be getting a little bit loose, and then they would all fall out. And at first I'd be really dismayed that I was losing my teeth. And then shortly after, I would start feeling this immense pain in my gums, and I would start cutting a new set of teeth, the second set of adult teeth, right? And when we think about that from an Indigenous perspective, I was holding a lot of the pain and discharging a lot of the pain that I was picking up from my son. So the vicarious, emotion that I was picking up, having to deal with my little son at night when he was cutting his teeth, I was discharging that in my dreams, right? That's what the Western dream science will tell us. And from an Indigenous perspective, it also tells us a little bit about the collective nature of dreams. I was having that dream for myself, but I was having that dream for my son as well. We were holding some of that pain together, right? And so the sort of collective and emotional nature of dreams can be particularly complicated for oppressed people, particularly for Indigenous people, also for African American people, and for other oppressed groups where there's a long history of intergenerational trauma, where a lot of the emotional stuff that we need to discharge is not only vicarious, but it's also intergenerational. And so being able to work with our dreams allows us to work through some of that emotional stuff and improve our affect regulation. So the spiritual aspect of dreaming is a particularly significant one for Indigenous people. And we're going to share two dreams from our family. I'm going to share one dream that I had, and then I'm going to invite my mother, Shirley Turcott, up here to share another. And so the first dream I want to share is I call it a visit from Bear. So in my early 20s, I decided to go back to post-secondary. This was the first time that I also had fully watched To a Safer Place, which is the documentary that the National Film Board of Canada made on my mother, Shirley Turcott, about her history of child sexual abuse and being the daughter of a pedophile, and how the complexities around that family. And of course, processing that as a young man was very challenging for me in a lot of ways to take all that in as I was watching this video. It was also a time when I was starting post-secondary, and as someone who had been raised largely with a Métis identity, right, through my mother's side, I was having to enter an institution where Indigenous and Métis values were not placed front and center, where I was going to have to be in a very different learning environment from the one that I had been nurtured in as a young child and as an adolescent, right? And so I had this dream that, I was sitting in my living room on a couch, and there was a glass sliding door onto a patio, and a black bear came up to that sliding door, and he just, with his paws, he just opened up that sliding door, and then he ran inside. He was ferocious, and to me it looked like that bear was running. He was running, and he was going to eat me. And when I had that dream, every time I had that dream, I would run from that bear. I would run from that bear, and then I would wake up before he caught me. I remember doing some work with Alana Young, another AFOT instructor who at that time was working for the First Nations House of Learning at UBC. And I came to her and I shared that dream. Now, another amazing thing you're going to learn about AFOT and dream work is bias control, right? We have a dream, we may have a dream at night, but we can visit that dream anytime we want during the day. And because dreams are alive and collective, when we visit that dream, we don't have to let it play out the same way that it did when we were sleeping, right? And so Alana said to me, what would it be like if you let that bear catch you? Which was something that to me seemed terrifying. But if I hadn't stopped to let that bear catch me, I wouldn't have realized that that bear wasn't coming to eat me. That bear was coming to deliver really important messages to me about some of the things that I was going to need to do as a Métis man to succeed in post-secondary education, about some of the aspects of ceremony and culture that were going to be so important to sustain me on the long, long road ahead, right? I ended up doing a PhD. I spent about 10 years in post-secondary education, and some of the messages that bear had were important for sustaining me along that journey, right? At that point, I started going to sweats with Dr. Lee Brown at the First Nations House of Learning, which was, I had grown up smudging, but I had not connected to the sweat ceremony. There was a lot of important messages there that bear had to bring for me. The second dream we wanted to share is we call a visit from Wolf, and it was a dream that my wife had when she was carrying my first son. And so I'm going to invite Shirley to come up here and stand beside me and just talk a little bit about that dream.
Okay, just a little bit about, hi everybody, nice to see you. Oh, there you are. Hi. Robin was with our first grandchild, his first son. Was having a lot of medical issues. It was very difficult to carry that baby because there were a lot of health issues that she had, really serious health issues. And she would be having dreams where what she described as big white dogs, which later coming from Texas, wolves weren't really part of her world there, but the big white dogs was actually a group of wolves that were coming at nighttime. And in her nightmare, the wolves would take the baby, and she would be frantic, and then as the dream continued, Jeffrey would go get the baby, bring the baby back from the wolves. And I think what was happening, seriously, what we decided in the end when we really checked into that dream, what was happening is that the wolves were taking the baby because her body really did need a big rest at night, because she was losing a lot of blood. And yes, the dreams were bloody, but every time the baby came back from the wolves, the baby was in really good shape. So it was as if the family of wolves were looking after little Jackson there while she was repairing her body while she slept, and then the wolves would bring the baby back. So I think she was going through a lot of healing physiology in the dream state. and the spirits of the wolves were looking after the little one, which was so fascinating about that dream through the years as we got to know the dream. Even like, when did Elder Josie Bear named Jackson? He was just
2 or 3.
Yeah, he was maybe 2 or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when Josie came to name Jackson, unbeknownst to the dream, unbeknownst to any of the things that had happened for Robin during the gestation of Jackson, the elder named Jackson Black Wolf Spirit. She felt and knew the wolf, and that Jackson was also part of the family of wolves. So that would be, a deeply spiritual understanding of how Indigenous dreams work, and how visits from elders can come and show up as wolves, or be the wolves themselves, because we are all one after all. Thank you. Go ahead.
So Indigenous dream science, Indigenous dream understandings have a lot to bring, and so does Western dream science. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about neurology, which is the scientific study of the physiology of dreaming, of the physical process of dreaming. So, and the influences of dreaming. And so, that term, neurology, was first used in France in 1653. And initially it was quite hard to study the physiological process of dreamings, particularly in the 1650s, right? Because we couldn't see what was happening inside the mind of the dreamer. And that all changed with Nathaniel Kleitman and Eugene Arskinsky when they pioneered the modern study of dreaming. And what really made that possible was the electroencephalograph. So many of you have probably seen videos of people with lots of suction cups on their head, going into an MRI or lying down and having a dream. And that's the electroencephalograph, which basically lets us observe the brainwave patterns and the active regions of the brain while people are dreaming. So more than 2 decades after that, so I guess it was more than 2 decades after the invention of the electroencephalograph, Patrick McNair discovered that we not only dream in REM sleep, as Nathaniel Kleitman and Eugene Arskinsky had discovered in 53, but we also dream in NREM sleep. So people often think about REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, as being the only time when we have dreams at night. We're starting to understand now what Western science has revealed is that there's 2 distinct types of dreaming, REM dreaming and non-REM dreaming, and that these 2 types of dreaming are doing really different things for us. And so I want to talk a little bit about these 2 different types of dreaming. So before I get into those differences, I'm going to just quickly talk a little bit about the sleep cycle. So we know that during sleep, our body alternates between REM and NREM sleep. One cycle of REM and NREM sleep lasts about 90 minutes. And REM sleep occurs first and takes up about 75% of that sleep. And then at the end, we get our REM sleep. So during NREM sleep, our body relaxes, it restores itself, a lot of the physiological repair is happening during that time. And then at the end of NREM sleep, we shift to REM sleep. And during REM sleep, that's when we see our eyes moving rapidly, and that's when our muscles are turned off. And most of our dreaming occurs then, simply because it's safe. Our muscles are turned off. We're not going to injure ourselves by acting out any of our dreams while we sleep. And I should just say they have actually done a lot of experiments on cats, in fact, where they've shut off the neurotransmitters that paralyze the body, and cats, while totally asleep, have gotten up and run and pounced and jumped. And so we know that cats dream about chasing mice and other insects. If you've ever wondered what your cat was dreaming about, mice and insects and other small creatures, right? Physically acting out their dreams, but also sometimes jumping into walls and off tables while they were doing that, right? So our brain is protecting us while we dream by paralyzing our bodies. So REM sleep is characterized by high brainwave activity and selective activation of the limbic system. So the limbic system is the very old center of the brain, often known as the emotional center of the brain. And so in particular, the amygdala and the hippocampus are there. The amygdala and the hypothalamus are there. And those are 2 regions that are very active during REM sleep. REM dreaming, what we're starting to learn is that REM dreaming indicates an actual attempt to move into and experience future possibilities. So it's focused on the future. It provides a safe space for us to face challenges and test possibilities. This is coming out of some of the research Matt Wilson has done at MIT about how dreaming in REM sleep allows us to think about the future and test out possibilities that we don't have to do in real life. We can test those out while it's safe, right? We also know that REM sleep, through this process of testing out future possibilities and thinking about what might work and might not, increases our creativity. And some of the studies they've done at MIT say that REM sleep can improve our creativity up to 40%. So during this time of REM sleep, different regions of the brain are communicating, they're talking to each other. And it's in this climate of communication and across the brain that we're able to consider new ideas, right? And we think that might be what's responsible for that increase in creativity during REM sleep. By contrast, NREM sleep is different. There's more activity in the frontal cortex of the brain rather than the limbic system, rather than the old brain. So we also know that during NREM sleep, there's an increase in positive reckoning. So they did some studies where people rated themselves. How good do I feel about myself? How much do I think other people like me? All that kind of stuff. And then they wake them up after NREM sleep and after NREM dreaming, and they fill out the same survey, and they feel better about themselves. Nothing has really changed, but they've had some time in NREM sleep state, and they feel better. Yeah, people really like me, more so than they did 5 minutes ago before that dream cycle, right? It's interesting, and what we've noticed is that people that are clinically depressed, they either totally skip the NREM sleep cycle, or they stay there longer. So they're getting less of that positive reckoning from the dreams, which is interesting when you consider their state of clinical depression. The other thing I wanted to say about NREM sleep is that while REM sleep is looking at future possibilities, NREM sleep starts to indicate, it tends to mirror past experience, and indicate a process of using past experience to think about how that might apply to our life today, whether it's problems we want to solve or how we feel about ourselves. And that's also stuff that's come out of Matt Wilson's work at MIT. So some of the work that the researchers are doing around NREM sleep is starting to indicate that NREM dreaming plays a really important function in also how we refine and improve our memory. And a lot of this work is still coming out now, and some of the memory research has been done by Stickgold, and I definitely recommend looking at some of that. Mm-hmm. You can keep going. Yeah. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about how sleep and dreaming regulates almost every aspect of our lives. And I want to talk about the brain and a little bit about how the brain cleans itself. We know that dreaming is helping us discharge a lot of our emotional energy that we pick up during the day. We know that it's helping us receive messages and solve problems. But what they've discovered most recently is that dreaming is also helping to clean out the brain. So there's something in the brain called amyloid beta. It's a protein that's present in our brain. Levels go up while we're awake, and then they go down while we're asleep. And so some sleep researchers have been trying to figure out what's happening with amyloid beta. And one of the reasons why they've been trying to look into this is because high amounts of amyloid beta in the brain are correlated with Alzheimer's disease. So we know that for some people, amyloid beta will build up and build up and build up in the brain. And often in those individuals, we see brain atrophy or Alzheimer's disease. And so, of course, it's been very interesting to research that, to think about how we can reduce these levels so that we could work towards treatments for Alzheimer's and other diseases. And so one of the researchers explained the body as being a river system, right? Our body is like a river system where we have blood vessels that go to every little part of our body, right? And we have lymph cells that travel throughout this network of rivers to every part of our body, and they pick up all the waste that's generated by the cells of our body, and bring it to our organs so that we can get rid of it. Now, the one place that these lymph cells don't go is the brain, right? So there's a question about how the brain actually cleans itself. So through through the creation of a new high-level microscope that could actually look into the brain, we were able to observe what happens to the brain at night. And it was really fascinating. So at night, we know that our brain changes dramatically. What's interesting is that our brain cells actually shrink to increase the spaces between them. Now, throughout the day, we have a fluid-filled sac in and around our brain that protects our brain, right, from rattling around in our skull, right? Now, at sleep, when we're asleep and when our body is paralyzed, there's no danger of our brain rattling around. We're laying down, right? And so at that time, when we're paralyzed by our own brain and we're safe and we're motionless, what we've discovered is that fluid-filled sac, it drains. That fluid-filled sac, our brain cells shrink, and the fluid filters all through our brain. And while it's filtering through our brain, all of the waste between the cells is being washed away, amyloid beta being one of the significant waste products that is being removed. And after it's been washed away, it restores again. And so what we know is that while we're sleeping, our brain paralyzes our body not only to get all of the benefits that we get from dreaming, but also to actually clean our brain. Our brain is actually being cleaned while we're sleeping at night. Okay, so from an Aboriginal perspective, dreams are alive and collective. They're stepping stones into traumatic places that allow access to unresolved trauma that would be difficult to access from an awake state. And we can do that while we're sleeping at night, but we can also do that during the day through the type of IFOT dream exercises that we're going to be working with later today. So daydreams, twisted thoughts, all of these things are providing great opportunities for us to get information about trauma and receive messages that are important towards our pathways to wellness. So dreams can contain traumatic memory fragments that may hold important insights into the healing process, or contain knowledge that will help direct our path to wellness. Nightmares also provide an indispensable rehearsals to survival, right? And twisted thoughts and fantasies and dreams, they carry implicit story elements that hold huge, insights into our wellness. So I'd just like to invite Shirley up to share a twisted thought, to learn a little bit about how twisted thoughts can hold huge insights into our pathways to wellness.
So twisted thoughts are really common when it comes to trauma. So I want to share maybe 2 or 3 twisted thoughts really quickly, because basically in the Indigenous world, we see ourselves actually dreaming all the time, whether we're dreaming at night, according to the Western thoughts around dreams, whether it's REM or NERM. NREM, or whether we're daydreaming. I'm going to talk about a significant daydream, twisted thought that saw me through the 80s, that allowed me to actually continue the work. That's how significant twisted thoughts are. So in the 80s, I had done the Film to a Safer Place, and I was going city to city and airport to airport, TV station to TV station, walking into different settings, talking about child sexual abuse in the country, and talking about it as an epidemic, and at a time when no one else was talking about it. And so there were a lot of responses to me saying those things out loud, everything from people trying to kill us, to physically trying to kill us, to people adoring us, and to prisoners sending outrageous hate mail to me, we were constantly under siege. Our family was constantly under siege, and at the same time, it was really important to continue to actually talk about the epidemic of child sexual abuse in the country. And even the reporters, if I was at a TV station, some of them would be sweating, some poor middle-aged man having to say the word incest out loud for the first time. It was really difficult for them, and difficult for me to be. It felt like I was constantly being raped. I'll use that word because it was taking out these rape stories and also always being under attack. So the twisted thought is always the same. I'm walking down the street. I enter this house. I go into the house, and it's the house. I hear children, a child screaming. I go into the house. The child is being raped, attacked by some pedophile, and I'm there fighting off the pedophile. I'm awake when I'm having this twisted thought. thought, and I get terribly hurt, but I manage to get the pedophile away, and I pick up the child, and I take the child out of the burning building, the horrible building, and I come out of the building, and there's this huge crowd of people, and they're all clapping. And I'm just completely all bruised and battered, and I've got this poor little child in my hands. That twisted thought is exactly what was happening in my world. And I would feel better after the twisted thought. I would have, oh God, it was just like, oh gee, what, whew. And then of course feeling, oh my God, why do I have a twisted thought like that? And how come it's repeating itself all the time? It was repeating itself all the time because that's exactly what I was doing. Every radio station, every audience, every, St. Lawrence Center, whatever theater I was in, wherever I was talking to these big crowds of people, I would be talking about rape, and I would be talking about torture, and I'd be talking about our children, right? So it was me practicing. I was practicing what I had to do every day, what I had to do every month to keep going. And it also was discharging. It was discharging the emotional horror of it all, of being, a pioneer in the area of incest. It's not an easy thing to do. And so the twisted thought stayed with me all the time that I needed it, to be able to rehearse what was happening, to be able to affect regulate what was happening, and to be able to prepare. So it was a really, really generous twisted thought, and I grew to love it over time. And it completely ended, that twisted thought dropped off when the external world changed a bit too, where it could handle hearing about incest and about child sexual abuse and about what happens to our children in the country. And so as the world began to hear better, and as I became more used to it, the twisted thought could disappear. Another wonderful twisted thought that I came across was for a woman in her 50s, and she was horrified that she would come home, and as she was coming home from work, she would think about her husband hanging. Actually, I think she was almost 60. Or she was 60-ish, coming into her 60s. And she would see her husband hanging. And she was horrified by this. And so we talked about it. And I asked her, where is he hanging? Is he hanging everywhere? You walk in the door. And she said, well, no, he's hanging in the den, and he's hanging in the basement. Well, that's pretty interesting. That's from an AFOT perspective, what happens in a den and what happens in a basement. And she described those two areas as being areas of work. You would work in the den, and he had his workshop in the basement. And so my question to her, well, tell me about your partner. How is he doing around work? And she mentioned that he hadn't worked in 10 years. So he was hanging around work. He was dead around work. So why was that twisted thought coming to her, I wondered. And so I asked her, how are you about your partner not working? And that wasn't really a good question, because that wasn't it at all. And then I asked her further, how are you around work? And she went on to say how exhausted she was. Her husband hadn't worked in 10 years. She was the breadwinner, and she was getting into her 60s, and she was wondering how she was going to make the next 5 years. It was a traditional home where she was doing all the homework as well. And I wondered if that twisted thought wasn't bringing her some really magical information about what that family needed to do so they could help her complete her next 5 years of work. And out of that twisted thought, her partner learned of her exhaustion and how difficult it was for her. And he started to pick up all the homework. He started to pick up the cleaning and the cooking, the shopping. And of course, the twisted thought dropped off. It never came back, because it did what it was there to do, is to help raise attention to the family. This was a collective twisted thought. It belonged to both her and her partner. Sometimes twisted thoughts can be very horrific when we're dealing with genocide and torture and trauma. They come with sometimes really hard to hear things. And I want to just share the hardest one that I had, the twisted thought. The woman, her twisted thought was one where she would see, in her daydream, she would see a child out of the blue in a little frilly outfit. The child was under 2, And in the twisted thought, she's licking the child's vagina. That's a pretty twisted thought. I mean, lots of thoughts can be pretty twisted. I've never met a twisted thought I didn't like, and I've never met a twisted thought that didn't have something in it to offer this poor woman having this repeated twisted thought. And so she was brave enough to enter it from an AFOT perspective. And I asked her if she could be the licker. What are you doing there where you're licking? Like, what are you feeling in your body? And it certainly wasn't a sexual, you could tell just by her sitting there, it wasn't a sexual feeling that she was feeling as she was licking. It was a horrible thing for her to have to try on. And she realized she was filled with sadness and grief, and she was cleaning this poor child's vagina. And when she entered it, when she opened that up more, it really was part of her history and part of her story. And it was this, her pet dog would lick her after she had been sexually abused and clean up the mess there. And so it was a powerful, twisted thought, but what was it really there for? I mean, that's the important thing in AFOT. These things don't come for no reason. They come because they're helpers. Twisted thoughts are helpers and dreams are helpers. And it was, in the end, for her, it was being able to really understand deeply and profoundly that she was not alone, that she was not alone after all these tragic experiences, and that this powerful relationship between her and her dog was a beautiful connection of love and adoration. The dog was mothering her, was helping her and seeing her through her most horrendous experiences. So there's so much beauty if you can build a better relationship with your nightmares and with your twisted thoughts to see what they do have to offer, because I don't know any other way she could have got there, and they don't come for no reason. Thank you for letting me share those twisted thoughts.
So thank you, Shirley. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit more about sleep paralysis and then move into some more AFOT discussion around dreams and dreaming and twisted thoughts. But I just wanted to bring us back to the notion of sleep paralysis and also night terrors. So we know that during REM sleep, the muscles in our body are paralyzed. And for those of you who are interested, that happens through two neurotransmitters. The first one is gamma aminobutyric acid, short for that is GABA, people call it GABA, and then also glycine. And it's both of these neurotransmitters together, not in isolation, that paralyze our body during sleep paralysis. So I think one thing that's really important to note is that sleep researchers conclude that in most cases, sleep paralysis is simply a sign that the body is not moving properly through the cycles of sleep. So you wake up before your body has caught up to basically releasing those neurotransmitters so that you can move. And so a lot of times just a regular individual will wake up. But we also know that people who have a high degree of trauma, post-traumatic stress, there can be things going on in the brain and it can affect the cognition around the release of those neurotransmitters. And so particularly people who are sometimes taking medication, sometimes not, and who have a high degree of trauma often experience sleep paralysis. There's been a long history of storytelling and folklore around sleep paralysis and shadowy figures or demons. This started centuries ago, and a lot of people we talk to in classrooms across the country will say, well, I've woken up before and I felt something pushing down on my chest, and I saw a dark figure standing in the room. And there's something that happens when we wake up in this state and we're still kind of dreaming, but we're not, and we have these neurotransmitters paralyzing our body. And so I just wanted to, again, invite Shirley Charcot up with me this time to talk a little bit about sleep paralysis.
Mm-hmm. Hi. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for saying that, because we dream in metaphor, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens at night, well, for trauma survivors, sometimes there's an over-release of those chemicals. So you wake up paralyzed and nobody ever stays in paralysis. Don't worry about that. I hear survivors say to me across the country, that they're afraid they'll never wake up. Of course, they'll never come out of their paralysis. There's nobody who got stuck in paralysis that we know of ever. So just wiggle your toe. The chemical will release very well over time, very quickly actually. And within a minute or so, if you start wiggling a bit, you can't stay paralyzed very long. And the other thing that happens is the under release of the chemicals. So with trauma survivors, they get too much or too little. And when you get too little, I used to get a lot of too little. So I would get up in the middle of the night, dream my house was on fire, just as a kid, go out into the kitchen, take a big pail of water and pour water all over the kitchen floor and then go pee in a closet, right? So this is just really normal. There's not enough chemical happening here, or there's too much chemical. Very normal with complex trauma when there's trauma. The one that concerns me the most for you as clinicians and therapists is that when it's normal when you are being paralyzed that you feel this big weight on top of your chest here. This is very normal. Everybody feels that if they are lucid and awake to notice that the paralysis being there. And because our brains are looking for something to attach it to, it needs to attach to something, but there's no external something happening because we dream in metaphor. And Jeffrey maybe can say a little more about that. What happens is we attach it to whatever we think it might be. So that means you might think it was your perpetrator, but it might not be, but that's the only thing your brain can remember. Or maybe you watched a lot of zombie movies, or maybe you watched a lot of horror movies, so you attach it to, an evil spirit. Your frontal cortex is always looking for an image to attach the felt sense to. The affect regulate, the affect. It's always trying to find an image to attach to the bodily experience. So it will fudge one. So you can have a false memory there, so as a therapist, just, you may have a lot of clients that come in and say, yeah, somebody came into my room and it might be just the chemical. So be very watchful. If it is a memory, have a different kind of detail to it. But if it's foggy and unreal and kind of unusual and like, oh God, some ghoul in the corner, right? It's probably just the frontal cortex trying to find an image to attach to the bodily experience. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say more about metaphor? I'm going to step out now. Bye for now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you will see more, you will hear more. If you're in Module 6, you'll hear more about this later. But just to talk a little bit about why we dream in metaphor. So every 90 minutes, we know that a biological, program clicks on in the brain when we're sleeping to start the dream cycle. And that starts at the very base of our brain in the brainstem in a little area called the pons. And it starts off as an orientation response. So an orientation response is like a clap, like when you hear a big noise and all of a sudden you stop attending to whatever you were attending to and you look to where the direction of that noise came, right? If you're at a restaurant having a conversation and a waiter drops a tray of glasses, you hear that smash and all of a sudden you've forgotten that conversation and you're looking to the area where that happened. That's an orientation response. So when the dreaming kicks in and when the sleep cycle kicks in, what happens is the pons start sending a cascade of orientation responses to the thalamus, up to a higher part of the brain, the thalamus. And typically, when you would hear an orientation response, if you were awake, you would go to your sensory organs. You would look with your eyes. You would hear with your ears. You would smell with your nose, right? But because your body is paralyzed and all your sensory organs are shut down, your thalamus can't get information from anywhere, right? So what does it do? It has to send some information up to the cortex because the cortex wants to know what's going on. And basically what the cortex then has to do, it sends the message up to the cortex saying, hey, there's something going on here, but I don't have any information. And what the cortex does is it has to attach the closest pattern match that it can guess from your previous experiences and memories to the emotional discharge that's coming with that orientation response. And the congruence or the match between the pattern of memory from the cortex and the orientation response and the emotional release that's happening from the limbic system and the thalamus, that's how you get your dream. And that happens because if the people that were in our dreams were literal, if when I dreamt about my mom, it was actually my mom, and if when I dreamt about my colleague Greg, it was actually Greg, we would create huge false memories. We would wake up with huge false memories, and we wouldn't know what had happened the day before and what had actually been a dream. It would be devastating to our intelligence system, to the way we understand the world. And so what dreaming in metaphor does is basically preserve our memory. Long-term memory is actually shut off while we're dreaming. It's only when you wake up right at the end of a dream that you're able to actually remember what that dream was, right? You got to write it down. You have to really try to hold on to it, or it's gone. And so that's a little bit about why we dream in metaphor. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to talk a little bit about dreams and meaning as we move closer to a close. And just say that long before the electroencephalograph made it possible to look at brainwaves and into the brain, people had to study dreams basically through discussions and through thinking about dreams and meaning. And that's important because a lot of the early dream theory that came up was based on symbols, and symbols being universal. A house means this, a cigar means that, a horse means this, a dog means that. But from an AFOT perspective, we believe that the dreamer knows the most about what a dream means. And that's because even though we all dream as humans, we're all cultural beings. We all have different histories. Even though dreams are collective and they're connecting us across generations, there's different significance for different people. And so we really believe that the meaning of a dream, it's the dreamer that knows that best. And it's through that approach of AFOT being therapist-driven and client-centered that we're able to honor the fact that the dreamer knows the most about the dream and work with them to be able to receive those messages. Yeah, okay.
I forgot about a collective dream.
Mm-hmm.
I should share one, shouldn't I?
Sure. We'll go on to the next slide, and then you can share a collective dream. Yeah, so not all dreaming. The other thing about AFOT is that not all dreaming happens while we're asleep. Right? So, we can also have lucid dreams, we can have daydreams, we can have meditative dreams, we can have twisted thoughts, we can have visions. All of these different things from an AFOT perspective are dreams, right? Alive and collective, right? So ancestors and other visions are also dreams, and they can be both bewildering and they can sometimes be terrifying, like with the twisted thoughts that Shirley was sharing. But despite the terrifying nature of twisted thoughts and nightmares and dreams, AFOT takes the perspective that we've never met a twisted thought we didn't like. We know that they're bringing valuable messages despite that the horrible imagery that might be there, right? So AFOT takes a client-centered approach, acknowledging that the dreamer can best interpret the dream, right? So dreams are collective and living, and you can revisit that dream anytime you like. When we're doing some dream exercises later, you'll see that you can also finish a dream a different way that you had it. You can enter a dream and you can let something else happen. I could let that, even though I ran away from the bear in the dream that I had every time I had it, I could revisit that dream during the day and let that bear come to me, right? So we know that we can let the dream continue, right? So when we think about dreams and we think about twisted thoughts, we know from an AFOT perspective that dreams contain traumatic memory fragments that hold important insights into the healing process, right? They contain knowledge that can help direct our path to wellness. They're stepping stones into traumatic places that allow access to unresolved trauma experience that would often be really difficult to access in an awake state. Do you want to share a collective dream before we close?
No, I thought we could talk about the dream that what happened during Truth and Reconciliation.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
This was a dream that the territory decided that it was a collective dream, and the plants within the Musqueam territory itself had decided that what was going to happen. We just had to listen. So in this dream, in real fact, Tanya Gomes was to do a medicine camp with Jerry Sparrow and along with your crew program, right, with the kids, the foster kids here in Vancouver. And she couldn't make it, so I was going to go replace her that day at medicine camp, and that night I had the dream that we were to make medicines for the TRC with 30,000 people, 30,000 survivors of Indian residential schools. We're going to be on Musqueam territory. We're coming here to this Coast Salish land. And it was a ridiculous dream. It was, what do you mean we're supposed to make medicines for the TRC? It seemed absurd, right? Mm-hmm. So I went to the camp, and I had to bring the dream and said to Jerry Sparrow, Elder Jerry Sparrow, our medicine guru, I had this dream. I just casually placed the dream on the picnic table, and the next thing I knew, all the foster kids and everybody in the territory were collecting the medicines from the land there at the UBC farm, and we were making medicines. We made medicines till the cows came home. We made jars and jars and jars of medicines to bring to the TRC. So that really was the territory itself casting a dream, saying how it was going to receive these survivors on this particular territory. We just had to get out of its way and do what it told us to do, what the land was saying we had to do. It was interesting to talk with the survivors at the TRC and what those medicines actually did for them. So I'm profoundly touched, because it almost makes me want to cry all the time that I say this story, because survivor after survivor talked about how the medicine saw them through those days. The land knew exactly what needed to happen here in this territory. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was a powerful dream. Bye.
Next slide. I think we might have one or two more. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in closing, I just wanted to say that, what we've really tried to emphasize is that dreams are living, metaphorical, and intergenerational opportunities for healing, wellness, and growth, right? They connect us to all our relations, right? As soon as you speak a dream, it has already grown. Each time you visit a dream, you have the opportunity to learn something new. And dreams grow as the dreamer grows, right? So I can revisit that dream I had of that bear, and I often do. And as I grow older, the things that bear needs to tell me change, right? So dreams are alive, and they're collective, and they're full of intergenerational knowledge and wisdom, right? The sleeping brain is foundational to almost everything that we do. We create the meaning of our lives while we sleep. Dreams are key to processes of learning, creativity, and survival, and they provide a window into ourselves and all our relationships. Dreams, from an Aboriginal perspective, honor the philosophy of all my relations. So, thank you. Mm-hmm.